Hello there, everybody. All right. So, not to be dramatic, but I wrote something as an intro, and I'm not going to remember it because I have a terrible memory, so I'm going to read it, so pardon me for not looking at you for a few moments. So, this talk is titled Finding Our Place in the Universe, and I'll get into why I chose that in a minute here. In the beginning, there was nothing. An absence of stars in space, an absence of light and dark, an absence of matter of any kind. Then, suddenly, something happened. Out of nowhere, an infinitely small point began to expand. As the swirling, heated particles catapulted themselves into the growing expanse of space, something was created from nothing. Over millions of years, these chemical reactions solidified and created burning stars and orbiting planets, and much, much later, on a small rock, circling in just the right place around the sun, the early ancestors of humans took their first upright steps and gazed up at the sky. They were a far cry from the selfie-snapping, social media-addicted, political, fast food-loving humans that we're so familiar with, but, believe it or not, we still share a few things in common. Believe it or not, we are animals. And though we may have become self-aware, learned to use tools, and thankfully mastered the fine art of indoor plumbing, those instincts still motivate our lives. So the reason that I chose Finding Our Place in the Universe, as I was debating on what I was going to call this, I was throwing around a couple different things, and then I realized the most important thing that we can learn throughout the course of our lives is that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. And I think that the universe is a beautiful representation of that. Because each of us is sort of our own little solar system. In astrology, that's literally the concept. It's the idea that we are represented by all these different aspects of ourselves, and they interact with one another. So each of you is a star. Hey, how about that, right? So the idea is that when you are born, you have the opportunity to shine. Now, just the same out in the vast expanse of the universe, there are some stars that are brighter, some are not so bright. And often, as it interestingly enough goes, the stars get much brighter as they're getting closer to dying. Now, rather than looking at in the mortal sense of when we get close, when we get old, everything gets brighter. It's not so much that, but think about it as when you get closer to a change. When you're going to change from being one star to another, or when you're going to go from being a bright sun to a blue giant or something like that, where you become a different heavenly body. And again, hey, how about that? So the beautiful thing is that when you can see that perspective, that you're part of something bigger, it helps you to understand that a lot of the problems that we deal with on a daily basis aren't really that big of a deal. Now, when we're trapped in, say, let's say we're on the side of the road and a police car is behind us and we're waiting for the officer to come over and check our license and registration, and we know that our insurance isn't exactly up to date, or that maybe we forgot to go to the DMV the other day, something like that, it kind of seems like a big deal. All of that ties back into what we said earlier, which was we're animals. So adrenaline is something that rules our lives. And we can spend great periods of time and effort to try and minimize its effects, that we can keep ourselves together. But in reality, the way that it works is inside of our head, we have two spheres. In the middle, we have the brain that we've always had, the reptilian brain. This is the part of your brain that's concerned with fight or flight. When things start to go wrong, it says, we got to either get out of here or we have to get rid of this thing that's bothering us. Now, luckily, over time, we got another brain on top of that, and that brain's called the mammalian brain, the mammal brain. That's just the root of that. That's the part of us that allows me to stand up here and talk to you without saying, why is everyone looking at me, and being very nervous. It allows me to compute things. Now, the problem is that when we still end up in stressful situations, our mammalian brain can trigger our reptilian brain. It can tell us something's wrong when really nothing's wrong. And most of the time, that's the case. So what we're going to talk about today is some very interesting concepts and motivators that inform our decisions and our life choices and how we interact with our surroundings. And hopefully, by the end of all of this, you might understand yourself a little bit better and therefore be able to make better decisions. Of course, that's all a matter of perspective again. But so when we are out in the world, okay, we're going to go back, let's say a couple thousand years, maybe even further back. We're going to be out and we're going to be nomadic, meaning we don't have a village, we don't have a town, we don't have a city. We're traveling around in groups of people. So when that starts to happen, we rely on food supply. We act just like all the rest of the animals where we follow the food around. We track hunting patterns, or if we find some nice berry bushes that we can make friends with for a little while. But basically what happens there is you're here. There's no existential crisis of what's the point and why am I here and why are my parents jerks, or why can't my kids just listen to what I'm telling them to do? All of that isn't really a matter of things, because you either conform or you go off and try and make it on your own, and most likely you don't make it. So we just are. Presence. It's a concept that I talk about a lot if you've ever seen me speak before, or if we've spoken on one-on-one. So when danger occurs, you end up in fight or flight. That's it. The end. And then you either get away from the problem, you get rid of the problem, and then there you are again, back on your path, right? So then thousands of years go by, and we start saying, you know what? We can say, you take care of this aspect of the food, and you take care of getting the water, and you figure out how to make something to keep the animals out at nighttime. You work on bringing the firewood in. We start to delegate tasks. And when all of that happens, then we become focused on, well, why is this my job? Why do I have to get the firewood? I'd rather go swim in the lake and bring some jars of water back. It's hot today, So when that starts to happen, we are safe enough that we begin to escape into our minds. And it becomes a whole new frontier, one that we're still trying to win over. So in that case, we can often get to the point of, am I always safe? So we're in this city, we have some walls, maybe we just have guards standing around making sure everybody's safe while we're all having dinner or whatever. And we can ultimately come to the decision that no, we're not always safe. And still to this day, is everybody safe right now? Most likely, okay? Yeah, everybody's good, okay. So that's all good and well, but when you're out into the world, the minute you step out that door, a car could peel around the corner and take you out, hopefully not. An airplane could crash out of the sky and take you out, hopefully not. We could have a sinkhole out of nowhere. All of these things are possible, very unlikely, but possible. So the idea is that we're not always safe, right? So then we get on this loop of, okay, so let's take that a step further, and if the worst happens and I die, what happens after that? So, at this juncture, I will make a little disclaimer that if any of you are offended by what I say, feel free to stick your fingers in yours and la la la, and life will be happy to bring this lesson around later. Then we start to come up with these projections of an afterlife. It's very interesting. One of my passions is mythology, most of which was at one time a religion. It was a spiritual belief structure of a culture. Sometimes it's expanded outside of that. But the idea of an afterlife was something that we sort of had to say, well, once we get this idea of who we are, we build this ego in the psychological sense, not in necessarily the metaphysical sense of something we're trying to defeat the ego or whatever. But the idea of you start to have self-importance. Well, I'm the best at gathering lumber in the whole village. So what are they going to do when I'm gone? They're going to have to get a couple people to do my job because I'm really good at this, right? So then we sort of build this ego behind us of, well, I'm here for a reason. I have to have a purpose. And so if that's the case, and my life gets taken away from me before I'm ready to let it go, what happens to me afterwards? I can't just not be around anymore. I can't just cease to exist. That's a very uncomfortable thing. So therefore, we end up getting to a point where we say, okay, so there's an afterlife. So we go somewhere, whether we go to the Elysian fields, whether we go to nirvana, whether we get reincarnated again, whether we go to heaven, whatever the case may be. So then we say, all right, well, this guy who's getting the food all the time, I know he burns my food on purpose. I watch him. He leaves it on the fire way too long, and he's a jerk to me all the time. I don't want to go to nirvana with him. I don't want him to be in Elysian fields with me. So somebody has to decide, you're right, you're wrong, you get the reward, you get the punishment, right? And so we have to have someone above all of this. Somebody has to be looking down and shaking their finger at you or saying, you're doing a good job, and giving you an applause. So then we start to create this idea of not necessarily the Judeo-Christian idea of a God that he sits up there on his chair all day, and I'm sure his legs must fall asleep constantly. So the idea is that there is someone in charge. The Egyptians had a wonderful idea of weighing your heart against a feather. But their gods had very human stories, just as with the Greeks, which later became part of the Roman mythology and all that fun stuff. Early religions that are polytheistic, meaning multiple gods, have fascinating insights on humankind because their gods were human-like. They personified some of those traits. And so when you have a god that kind of messes up and, whoops, I just cheated on my wife for the 8th time, and now we've got more demigods running around, sorry, and Zeus kind of goes off by himself. It's, well, Zeus did it, and so it makes him a little more relatable. Whereas when you have someone sitting up on a throne looking down at you, there's not a whole lot of connection there. One of the most interesting things I found with, say, Judeo-Christianity, for instance, for those of you who don't know, I was Catholic for most of my life. I was going to be a priest and all this fun stuff. So that was my first foray into all of mythology or religion or spirituality, all that fun stuff. But what I've often found interesting was that people were constantly trying to have a relationship with God. So there are people who make that as a statement. I have a personal relationship with God, with my Creator. And these were wonderful things for people to say. But I heard those people say that a lot. And at a certain point, when someone keeps saying something over and over and over again, you have to question, who are they trying to convince? So when we have the idea of an afterlife, someone who's in charge, we have to have someone who decides what happens, who receives reward, who receives punishment. And then that's where the idea of we have a God. That God may be in charge of everything. He may be in charge of just the harvest, say Bacchus, for instance, or Dionysus, the god of wine and good time. Hey, but then ultimately we say, okay, that makes us comfortable for a few generations, say. But then stuff goes wrong. The vineyards all dry up. We have a terrible crop harvest. Bacchus and Dionysus aren't so happy with us. Well, what are we going to do? That's where we get to the wonderful point of deification. Okay, the idea of someone being involved with the deity or someone becoming a deity. So we have a couple different types of people and how they interact in that way. One is God spoke to me, like a holy person. Say Moses goes up onto the mountain and comes down with some tablets and finds out that the people have been doing some smelting work, and he gets not so happy with the shiny bull that's standing in the middle that they're dancing around. So he breaks them and he goes, sorry, and I got to Control, delete that, and go back up the mountain. And hey, God, do you have another copy by chance? Just one more. I promise I'll keep my temper this time. Then you have someone who's either an intermediary, someone who receives and then delivers the message. Or you have someone who's an intercessor. So that falls into the category of someone who is talking to the gods on your behalf. They are established as being someone who does that. So that would be the idea of, again, in Catholicism, the idea is that the priest, when you go into confession, you're confessing your sins to God, and the priest is just there as a physical representation of the divine. This, of course, exists in other traditions as well, the idea of someone who is basically, that human being is the walkie-talkie to God, or gods, or whoever you're trying to talk to at the time. Then we get to the fun stuff. The gods speak through me. So that's someone who channels the gods or spirits or an entity. That energy comes into you, and you are no longer there. You check out or you step aside, and they step into the driver's seat. So that would be someone who is a vessel. Then you have someone who's a mouthpiece, where they're still there consciously, but they tap in. And this would be something along the lines of claircognizance, which is where you receive information, as opposed to clairvoyance, where you see things, all that fun stuff. But the greatest downfall of all of this, the problem that lies at the root, is that these people often either become elevated by those around them. They look at them and they say, this person has something special. And so, really, they have the same thing that everyone else in the village, everyone else here has. You all have that connection. It's just a matter of accepting it. It's a matter of using it and finding out how. What happens is the person who gets elevated, whether it goes to their head and they end up trying to identify with the divine, or whether it's that you lift them up and they feel separated as the result of that. The most important thing to remember is that every single one of us is imperfect. None of us is perfect. None of us. We are all human first. So people who dedicate their lives to communicating for God. I think when I first went into a seminary and spoke with the priests that were there, that was one of the strangest experiences of my life, was going out into the field after they were all done, and we played volleyball. And they weren't wearing their vestments. It was very, very strange seeing them in jeans and a t-shirt. And it created this disconnect in my mind that, well, what are they still holy now? Or, I mean, because there's some holes in their jeans, I guess that counts. They've it really creates a strange dichotomy. We look past the human. We only look at what they're capable of. So when we can acknowledge that this person is human first and foremost, when those of us who do work with the divine, do work with energies in a conscious manner, when we move past our humanity, when we either ignore or set aside our humanity for the favor of doing this job, whether we do it egoically or not, we're doing ourselves a disservice, because we're all human first. So that's the first thing. If I could impart that to every human being on this planet, that would be the only thing I'd tell them. I'd say, hey, relax. And two, just because somebody says that they speak on the behalf of someone else out there doesn't mean that they're any less human. So that's the fun thing that I wanted to talk about first. Then the next thing that we're going to talk about is each of us on a regular, everyday level. So there's something called Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs, and so that's where we're going to look at here. First, the first thing that we look at are biological and psychological needs. So these are the things that we need when we're traveling from village to village, or even before that, when we're not even in groups, when we're just one individual creature scurrying about the ground. We need air, obviously, food, drink, shelter, warmth, sleep, rest, activity, oxygen. We need a balance of all of these things that keep us alive and functioning. So those are the first things that we address. Once we get all of those needs met, then we move up a step where we get to the needs of safety. Okay? This is where things start to get interesting, because safe to you might not be safe to you. it's completely subjective, because when we look at things, especially from our modern standpoint, safety is a matter of, are you okay? And your past comes into that and say, well, I'm not in a really okay place right now, whether it's up here or out here, whatever the case may be. So that involves protection. Do you feel protected? Security. Do you feel secure in where you are, what you're doing? Order, that everything is falling in place. And of course, that very seldom happens for a long period of time. Law is another thing. This is what gets put into practice. And it's interesting because this is really the building blocks of a successful civilization. Once the needs of the body are met, then we start to implement all of these systems. So then we put limits, and we look for stability. We look for consistency. Once all of those needs of safety are met, then we build another one, another layer, which is a feeling of belonging and love. And that's where our family comes in. That's where we're no longer, Mama Bird raises us in the nest and then pushes us out one day, and hopefully we figure it out. We look for family. We look for a group. Now, another thing that's important to mention there is that family doesn't just have to be mom and dad, sister, brother. A lot of us have found family here. We've been part of a group, and we've separated from that group for one reason or another. And we've come to places like this, and we find community. We find other people that go, yeah, I know what you're talking about, or at least that don't say, you're crazy, and dismiss you, right? Hopefully we find somewhere in the middle there. But the idea is that as you do that, it creates a sense of belonging, and that's really at the root of our happiness. So that sense of community is the next thing that we build. Then, atop of that is esteem. Self-esteem, the idea of, I'm worth something. And that's when achievements and status creeps in there, and responsibility and reputation. So all of these things cause concern. Just as much as they make us feel good when they're present, when they're absent, they make us feel concerned. And then finally, on the top, the fun one, the reason why we're all here, self-actualization. Okay, personal growth, fulfillment, what's my purpose, what's the point, why am I here, all that fun stuff. Now, when we go through this process of self-actualization, and we say, you know what, I'm here to do X, Y, and Z, this is my purpose, I got it. Then we have a tendency to focus and hone in on that one thing so much that everything else falls away. And that takes us back to what I just talked about. So say you don't communicate with spirit for a living, or for a hobby, or for a part-time job. Say you work at Walmart, right? You can focus on all you need to do to be successful at your job at Walmart, whether you hate it, whether you love it, whatever, in between. But when that becomes your sole focus in life, and you come home, you sleep, you wake up, and you go back to work again, chances are, if you don't feel it right away, somewhere down the line, life's going to knock on the door and going to tell you some things you're not too happy with. That's when midlife crisis attacks. That's when Saturn returns happen, for all of you who speak astrologies. The idea of these things come back around, and they say, all right, you set off in that direction. Is that really the way you want to be going? Did you miss a turn somewhere going back in Albuquerque? And so when you can take a moment and reassess where you are and where you're going, that's when you can often make little adjustments. Rather than saying, I've been in a marriage for 40 years that I didn't want to be in for 2, and now we have 3 kids and 2 grandkids, and now I want to get the hell out of here, Okay, now what am I going to do? Now, we're going to side shuffle out of the spotlight and hope that nothing falls apart. When you really end up in that position, all it is life saying, you're not dead yet. You're not a star growing brighter and brighter. You still have a chance. Sometimes we miss it when life whispers that to us. And so life says, okay, and it hits you over the head with the sign, That's how it goes sometimes. We're all here for a reason. Now, whenever people ask me that existential question, my uniform answer is, we're here to leave this place a little bit better than we found it. That's the best way, I feel, to sort of boil everything down, to give people the idea that you don't have to do anything. And that's kind of fun to think about things that way, even though we feel, well, we got to follow the laws and we got to do this and that. Now, I didn't say there weren't consequences, but we don't have to do anything, right? So, again, that gets back to these levels of safety. You know, that's the level one up from keeping our body alive. There has to be some order. So that's where we all say, okay, look, we're not going to walk down the street and punch each other in the face every time. We're going to shake hands, we're going to high five, whatever. That'll be sufficient. But when we can get to the point that we understand those things, we integrate ourselves into culture, into society, and we can begin to share an ideology, the way that we view the world, or at least our culture, that's when we can truly start to work on ourselves as individuals. Now, that being said, one of the interesting things, if you ever do any research about tribal culture, and even when we got into a little bit bigger, where we lived in small towns or kingdoms, those sorts of things, they all shared similar ideology. There were always people in the background that creeped around in the shadows and talked about these little mysterious things, or was somebody who moved in from another town and they're kind of hiding away in your closet, and you talk about these secret, the secret idea about how life really works, or this God is really great, and you have a little secret altar for them. But people would unify over those ideology, and that's the whole reason they were there. So take that concept into modern day, into now. If any of you find yourself in a town that you don't agree with the ideology of everyone else, all of your fellow townsfolk, you can move. You can go to another town. And luckily, it doesn't involve a physical relocation most of the time. So give yourself that opportunity too. Don't strap yourself in. Don't feel like I have to do this, because you don't. So now I want to move on to another one. This is another version of things, of human core needs. I'm going to draw them because it's sort of a scale. It's a balance between the two. So the first thing is certainty. And please forgive me if I spell anything wrong. I'm going to do my best not to. We have certainty on this side, and we have variety on this side. All right? Yes. Okay, so these are personal needs. Certainty and variety. We need a common balance because, hey, we all become robots. We all wear, this is it. We're all going to wear the silver jumpsuit with the V stripe, and that's it. Fashion is over, right? Not the best world to live in, by our standards, of course. So certainty is beautiful, but variety is the spice of life, as they say. So when we can look at things and say, okay, maybe I just have a little too much variety in my life, rather than saying everything is utter chaos, it helps to frame it a little bit better, right? We just want to get a little closer to certainty. Let's make things a little more certain. So give yourself that opportunity to look at things from a different perspective. Things aren't falling apart. Life isn't a mess. You just have a little too much variety going on right now. Okay? So next is significance. On one side and on the other side, we have love and connection. So, significance says, here I am, look at me on the pedestal. All right, everybody's looking at me right now, and they're listening, and I've got the big loud microphone so everybody can hear me. I'm important, here I am. And then I say, well, it's kind of lonely up here, and I wish I had somebody to bounce this stuff off of so I didn't have to talk the whole time. And so that's the balance between significance and connection. It's the idea of, here I am, okay? But then I also want to be part of something. So when you feel that you're pushed out of a group, say, because all of a sudden you start talking about these taboo topics for your town, understand that just because you're becoming a significant outcast doesn't mean that love and connection are not attainable. They're still out there. It's interesting when we talk about in the United States the difference between the East Coast world and the West Coast world. The West Coast world of hey, whatever you want to do, whereas the East Coast world's a little more, good old Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and some of us still have our pilgrim hats in the closet. So the idea is that when we look at those things, we often feel out of place. One of my favorite things is when people come in here into this store and they don't know what they're walking into. And they walk in and they kind of smile and they look around, and then I see them leave like this with their eyes very wide. Like, I shouldn't have gone in there. I have to go do my penance now. So it's wonderful because it's such an interesting thing. But my favorite part about that is I know that's going to stick in their minds, because their reptilian brain may have said, danger, danger, danger. This is terrifying. But then later on, it's going to set something off in their head that at least they'll know there's something else out there. And they didn't walk in and I was stirring a cauldron and said, come on in, and so, do you have any I have newt by chance? And so it's not about that. It's understanding that when you realize that there is something else, then you don't feel as stuck where you may be. It says there is another shore. You're not just sailing off into an endless ocean. And often the people who discover these shores are the people who are so tired of the mainland, of the place that they've been all their life. They feel so stuck there that they say, I would rather be out on a ship in the middle of the ocean for the rest of my life than stay here. So those extreme circumstances often find these beautiful places. And so what happens, aside from that, one of my favorite things about Greek epics is that often you'll see a Greek hero go off on a journey to find some golden fleece or some sacred object passed down from the gods. And along his journey, he finds out all kinds of interesting things about the world around him and subsequently about himself. And then he comes back to the same house, to the same wife who cooks the same meatloaf every night. And all that's changed was him. So when we have these ideas, if we have to go on a pilgrimage to this sacred place, that's the only way that we can get this blessing. It's the only way that we can figure this thing out. Take that into consideration. Realize that the sacred that you're in search of exists within you. You're going to drag it along to that sacred site. And though you may stare into the mirror of that place and see yourself right back, you could just as easily do that in your bathroom. So that brings us to spiritual growth. We have growth and contribution. Growth comes first. Growth says, all right, I'm a stranger in a strange land, and I have to figure out what the deal is here. So you put yourself into the environment. You look around. You find a friendly face, and you ask them questions. You try and figure out how it goes. Many of you may have had that experience coming here. Those of you who have been here for a while, and those of you who are new here, welcome. I'd be happy to be that friendly face. Ask away, okay? Growth happens. We start to say, okay, the old structures and systems may be similar, but do not apply here anymore. And again, that sets off that reptilian brain that says, danger, danger. Things are different. But then after a period of time when we realize that new isn't always scary, that's when we start to learn. When things are different, it only means that we have the chance to grow, the chance to expand. Because those seeds could say, I like being surrounded by dirt. I'm just going to stay here. And the water comes down and the sunlight bounces off of the earth. Nothing ever becomes of them. But in order to blossom, in order to grow, we have to step into uncharted territory. We have to break through the surface. Many of us end our lives. We live within this box that either we were placed into by our parents. We say, okay, here you go, here's your box. Enjoy your life. And we spend our whole lives in there. Every once in a while we try and stretch it a little bit because it starts to get tight after a while. Maybe put in an end table that we don't need, something like that. And then we say, things get a little tighter. And then all of a sudden we find ourselves growing in the shape of that box. And I always use this joke all the time, but it very seldom lands. I always say, and you're surprised when you wake up and you're a square. That's old terminology. But anyhow, so when you can take the time to look around you and say, there's a world outside of this box, that's when you can start to look at it. And it's always scary. I promise, it's always scary. It might be scary for a millisecond. It might be scary for 10 years. But when you make the step over the wall of that box that you've grown up in, that's when things start to change. That's when you get fresh, new opportunities. And then what ultimately happens? You go back and you find your box and you put it up on the wall in your big home and you say, I am so grateful for that box. Because if I had been born out here, I might not have made it. I wouldn't know what things were, where to go. I wouldn't have had any frame of reference. And that's truly the healing journey that these Greek heroes go through. They realized that the thing that they were trying to leave, the anger that motivated them, that the gods killed my family, or this was wrong, or this is terrible things going to happen, or I like that princess in the city over, I'm going to go beat this monster so we have a family. All of these motivators, when we look at them initially, they become a destination. But then once we get there, we realize that, as we were told, happily ever after isn't really a thing. Because eventually Prince Charming gets a little bit older. His pants don't fit so well anymore. He doesn't really ride his horse. Maybe his horse is getting a little too old to ride around. His back's getting a little warped. He doesn't keep up his velvet cape as well as he used to. Dry cleaning bills are very expensive. And so as a result of that, he ends up in a world where he's just another guy. So if you married him for his velvet cape, you're in for a disappointment. Just the same as this beautiful woman who fit into this glass slipper. Well, you walk around in those high heels long enough, she's going to tell you it's not going to be very comfortable. She's rather the flats. So the idea is that these sort of romanticized ideas of where we're going to go, what we're going to achieve, what we're going to become, all of these things are false ends. Now, when we look at them as mile markers, we're going to get to this point, and then we'll see what happens from there. That's a beautiful thing. That helps you get through. I can speak from experience. I remember when I was at the point in high school where I said, I hate school, I can't stand it. My dad said, well, just think about it this way. You get to school, look forward to lunch. And then once lunch is over, then look forward to the end of the day. Get through your classes, pay attention, write down your notes, do your homework, and then it'll all be fine. And sure enough, we can apply that to our lives. We can say, okay, right now isn't so hot. I'm not so happy with it. But it doesn't mean I'm going to go off somewhere else in my mind. I'm going to keep my eye on this destination. But it's still just as important to row every step of the way. Be present every time that paddle touches the water, proverbially. Hopefully you're not all out, and it's not supposed to snow or rain or anything. I don't think so. The idea is that growth allows you to progress in life. Then you get to the other side, which is contribution, and that says, here I am, guys. I'm back from my epic journey. I don't know what I'm going to do with this fleece made out of gold. It's pretty brittle. I guess we could melt it down into a ring or something. I don't know. Maybe a crown. I like crowns. Crowns are good. I could wear a crown. And so we try and figure out what we do with the spoils of our journey. And so we try and give it to people, and we say, hey, you look like a guy who could use a golden fleece. How about that? I have a couple heating bills to pay, and unfortunately the electric company doesn't take golden fleeces as payment, so let's see if we can work out a deal here. So then you can do that, or you can go through contribution and say, all right, if anybody ever encounters a hydra, okay, don't think you can just cut the one head off and you're done. It doesn't work that way, okay? So you can contribute the information that you've gained. You can contribute the goods that you've gained. But ultimately, if you cease to grow, you'll find yourself in longing again. All of this has to do with that existential crisis. It has to do with who am I, where am I, and what am I worth? All of that ties back into the concept that I talk about all the time, which is presence. Because no matter where you are, there you are. For those of you who have seen Austin Powers, the first one of my favorite lines in that movie is when he's in Las Vegas and he's walking down the stairs and a cowboy's coming up the other side and he says, oh, there you are. And he goes, well, how do I know you? And he goes, no, but that's where you are. You're there. And then he keeps moving. So that's a very useful thing to keep in mind. The idea of wherever you are, that's where you are. And it's funny because we get lost in this world of ours. We get lost in the world around us. We get lost in the world within us because we overcomplicate everything. But ultimately, those decisions are up to each and every one of us. Life is only as hard as we make it, as hard as we allow it to be. That can seem like a big responsibility, but again, it's only as big as you allow it to be. Because I could just as easily turn off this microphone, or not, and just walk out that door right now. Not say anything to anybody. And it might be strange. You might not know what's going on, where I'm going, why I'm leaving. And I don't have to tell you. I could just go. Don't even have to say bye. See? I changed my mind. So, I still got a little bit more. I don't want to leave you hanging. So, but the idea is you can do that too in life. We have these social norms that we've built up. The idea of, hello, how are you today? You meet somebody for the first time, you exchange names. All of these social norms. They have their place. They absolutely do. As a tool to grow. But the moment you feel them limiting you, look at those things. Find out why you feel limited by self-imposed responsibilities, self-imposed structure. Often it's not a matter of turning them away, ignoring those things. Often it's a matter of saying, what can I change to make this more practical, more applicable to my life? Often that's all it is. Because just the same as we have to figure out how we can contribute to our society, we also have to keep in mind our growth. We are constantly teetering back and forth between all of these things. When I teach meditation classes, I always tell people, when you have this idea of meditation that you have to sit in silence and clear your mind, it's nonsense. It's not possible. What you have to do is, rather than walking around as a bowl in your life, when you're meditating, you become a tube or a conveyor belt. And you watch the thought come, and you say, oh, there's that thought. And just the same, you let it leave. Because it doesn't serve you at that moment. You don't need that tool. Just be. So as you grow, as you contribute, as you find significance, as you find love and connection, as you find certainty and variety and the balance between all these things, presence isn't something that stays with you. You don't stay here present in the center. It doesn't happen. But what you can do is keep in mind both of these sides, which are not necessarily opposites, but parts of a whole, two sides of a coin. And when you keep them in mind, both of them, you can say, okay, where am I right now? Which am I closer to? On a scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. And then it's just a matter of making an adjustment in that number. That's not a daunting task at all. It's just a step to the left, right? Yeah. So when you give yourself the chance and you give yourself the opportunity, and the reason I keep saying that over and over again, give yourself the chance, give yourself the opportunity, is because you could talk to anybody who's speaking for God, who is God. They can tell you anything you want to hear, anything you don't want to hear. But ultimately, it falls into your hands. You have to make the change. You have to make the adjustment. You have to let that go. Growth is in your hands. Stagnation is in your hands. You can stay right where you are. You can leave those doors the same you came when you walked in. Or you can say, you know what? Maybe I am worth that change. Maybe I am worth that adjustment. Maybe I am worth letting that go. And when you give yourself that opportunity, when you realize that you're worth that, not because of what you can do, but because you are you. That's it. It doesn't require anything of you. You don't have to qualify for this. You're here. You already qualify. You're pre-qualified. It all comes down to love. Because, as they say, love and fear, trees with many branches, many incarnations, and both bear fruit. It's just a matter of which one you want to pick from. And if you pick a rotten piece of fruit off of the fear tree, guess what? You don't have to eat the rest of it. You can put it down and get one off the love tree. It's all up to you. You have the power, and that power is love, like Huey Lewis said. He was right. And so when you can employ that, put it into your life, when you can act out of love, you will never go wrong. You will never fail. Even if things don't go the way you expected them to go, you'll still grow. Things will still happen. The moment that you step into fear, when you allow your reptilian brain to say, hold up, something's wrong, that's when you stay still. You cease to grow. Because discoveries were not made by sitting in the armchair at home. They were made by traveling into the vast unknown. The one thing that I hope that I live long enough to do is hopefully have my consciousness put into a robot and travel out into the vast expanses of space. Nothing I would love more. Because nothing fascinates me more than the vast expanse of the unknown out there. There are beautiful sights to be seen, terrifying sights to be seen. But what we can understand is that macrocosm, the big, is reflected in the microcosm of us. We are each a solar system. We are each a star. We get to choose when we shine our light very bright. We get to choose what we pull towards us, what we throw away. We get to choose what fuels that fire that makes us shine bright. And whether we are a beacon of light and hope and love to everyone that we meet, or we spread the fear that keeps us from growing. Thank you all very much.